Hello, WiCCD members. My name is Maya Shukeri, and I am WiCCD's Education Committee Director. I'm happy to introduce our series, Finding Your Niche. In this series, we will interview female criminal defense lawyers who practice in a specific area within criminal law. The goal of our series is to highlight the work and accomplishments of female criminal defense lawyers, but it is also a way for us to introduce you to specialty areas within criminal law. We hope we can help you find your niche. Enjoy the series.
Hi, Maria. How are you?
I'm great, Maya. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's very nice to see you, and thank you for taking the time to do this interview with me today. Um, Maria, I'm going to start right away by asking you, what is it that you do?
I'm actually a licensed paralegal through the Law Society, and I also am a co-director on the Board of Innocence Canada, as well as their Human Resources Committee and the chair of the Education and Outreach Program.
And since when are you a licensed paralegal?
So I was an unregulated paralegal prior to licensing, so from 1997, and then when licensing came in, I was licensed by the Law Society in 2016, just after my acquittal.
Okay, and so you mentioned your acquittal. So maybe if you can just tell us, for people who don't know about your story, how is it that you became paralegal and what's the background story?
Sure. So I'm one of Canada's wrongly convicted, and I am part of the cases of the former disgraced pathologist Charles Smith. I was wrongly convicted in the death of my 3-year-old stepdaughter, and that happened in 1991. So it would take about 25 years, around 25 years, to have my name cleared, despite my professing my innocence those years. And so on February 29th, 2016, with the assistance of James Lockyer as my lead appellate counsel, the court finally acquitted me and gave me back my name and freed me from that miscarriage of justice. So as a result of that, not long after, my defense counsel, I called him to say that I was looking for a job once I was released from prison. And he said that he was looking for somebody to answer his telephones in his law office that he was opening in Brampton. So I said, yes, I would like to take up the opportunity. And I ended up staying with him for several years, operating the criminal defense office, the practice for criminal lawyers, and a short brief time for family lawyer and also immigration lawyer.
Okay. And I guess that's how you then decided that you wanted to become a licensed paralegal. It was from that experience that you had in the lawyer's office.
A combination of both going through the whole miscarriage of justice and the wrongful conviction, and then leading into working at the criminal defense office. It all sort of meshed together, and felt that I was meant to be in this area now.
And that criminal defense lawyer, it's the same lawyer, it's James Lockyer, right?
No,
That
it was
you, oh,
actually
it's a different,
another lawyer. Yes. Yes.
okay, another lawyer. All right. And ever since, I guess you've been involved then in the criminal justice system, but working now in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, so now as part of my paralegal practice, what I do provide is I provide a lot of support for criminal defense counsel. And that is, if I need to prepare charter applications, if I need to locate witnesses, prepare subpoenas, have them issued to the court offices, and then also serve the witnesses themselves. We provide that kind of assistance to counsel. And as well, I do summary conviction criminal once in a while when it crosses my office, and see what I can do with a recent success on a summary conviction in the last 2 years.
All right. And you have your own office now.
I do, yes. So I used to have a physical office pre-pandemic, but given that we're all doing hybrid and remote, all of my staff are actually remote, and we do meetings just like this.
Yes, that's great. Now, Maria, one of the things that I think many people are wondering when they hear about your story and what happened to you in the past and the wrongful conviction is how did you even, like have the appetite to still be around criminal law, the criminal justice system after what happened to you? I mean, the expectation is, or what people would think is maybe you were just, I mean, did it not make you become bitter that you didn't want to deal with it anymore because you're very close to the criminal justice system now? You're dealing with it, I guess, on a daily basis now. So maybe you can explain to us how this process happened and how is it that you're still dealing with it despite what happened?
Sure. So I truly believed all along. The first thing is forgiveness is something that's very significant in any part of aspects of our life. So when I was acquitted, I actually forgave Charles Smith for what he had done to my family rather. But it certainly doesn't eliminate things like accountability that I felt that he should have faced in terms of, potential criminal charges. But at the same point in time, I feel like, and I always have felt that change happens from within. And everybody that's been through a wrongful conviction handles their trauma uniquely. In my case, I decided to free myself of Charles Smith per se by giving him that forgiveness. But at the same time, I felt that there was something that we needed to do in order to educate the rest of the world and prevent miscarriages of justice. Hence why I'm doing all of the advocacy work that I do now. So my choice to still work in a system that wronged me, um, I think that I could have chosen to lie down and give up. I could have chosen to turn to alcohol and drugs. I chose what was going to be the best thing, not only for myself, but for our community as a whole. And I'm seeing that now through the advocacy work that I do. I spend, a lot of time going back and forth between the United States and Canada, and I deliver keynote addresses, and I work with some very powerful institutions. And what I've learned from all of this is that the perception that I had of the criminal justice system was basically from what I had seen on TV until I actually lived through it. I had perceptions of what judges or justices were like. But what I've come to realize, if I look at justice systems comparatively around the world and how we operate here in Canada, I feel firmly that we're one of the best in the world. But we're not a flawed system. We actually, I don't think any system is ever going to be perfect. I'm not a promoter of that word perfect justice system because perfection it's non-existent. But what we can do, and what I see that Canada is doing right now, especially here where I sit, is that changes are trying to be made, and awareness and learning and teaching about the causes is really, really happening now, which we wouldn't have seen 2 or 3 decades ago. It was very much in Pandora's box then. So I'm quite pleased. So if I can participate in that or contribute towards that, that's where I'm at.
Okay, so you actually mentioned that you are seeing changes. So are these changes? I'm guessing they're positive ones, right? Because you're pleased with them. So what is it that you notice? Like, what kind of changes? What improvements have you seen?
So two of the most significant changes that I've seen recently have to do with one, the way that expert witnesses are
Hmm.
dealt with in the courtrooms. And that is, we have to critique them more and actually check and see what their actual experience is and whether or not their CVs check out. And the court is taking a closer look at whether or not they'll allow expert witnesses to testify and provide this kind of evidence in criminal cases. So that's really, really important because 2 or 3 decades ago, there really wasn't much oversight happening. The second one is a far more in-depthly inquiry process. 2 or 3 decades ago, and I can say firsthand from experience that just a simple yes was enough to be wrongly convicted of a homicide or an alleged homicide, but it was actually a non-crime. And that shouldn't be happening now. What I suggest and recommend often is that there has to be more dialogue between the bench and the accused as well, to try and see whether or not there's anything driving a plea. And if it is in fact a true plea, to ensure that all the facts surrounding the plea are legitimate. So there are two very, very significant areas that I know that changes are being made right now, which I'm happy about.
And just on that notion of a dialogue between the bench and the accused, so do you mean like in the plea inquiry process?
Yes, absolutely. So in most cases, I mean, at least what I've seen in the past has been that most of the time defense counsel will speak for the accused or their client. If I was able to perhaps speak at that time and maybe give my explanation or what had happened to me with that police officer, it may have been received differently than how it would have been if it was just from defense counsel itself. So in essence, what I'm saying is defense counsel makes a presentation that there's something behind the plea that's questionable, and then the court can actually go through any details or ask the accused and at least make them feel comfortable to come forward if there's any duress or coercion to that false guilty plea.
And was a trial not an option in your case, or?
Yes, a trial, there definitely was the option of going to trial. However, I had two scenarios placed before me. The first one was that if I accepted the early guilty plea, that my sentence would be significantly reduced to 2 years less a day, and in an environment where I can actually have touch visits with the children, and a recommendation for early parole could be made in time for me to deliver my unborn daughter, versus proceeding to trial with the profession of innocence and then a finding of guilt at the end of a trial, being wrongly convicted, and they would have sought 5 years at the Kingston Prison for Women. And if that was the case, I can only imagine that I may have spent the entire 5 years sitting in prison waiting or hearing appeals upon appeals being rejected at that time. So in hindsight, due to the dire circumstances, the false guilty plea was the right way to go.
And in your case, just again for people who are not familiar with your case and the facts of the case, the opinion of the doctor, because there wasn't a trial in your case, it went straight to a pre-inquiry, but the opinion of the doctor came out through a preliminary inquiry.
Right. So Charles Smith, I did have a preliminary hearing, and Charles Smith did produce some evidence at the preliminary hearing, which committed me for trial. Once we set the matter down for trial, I believe I was into day 2 of the trial, and that's when the false guilty plea was entered. Okay. But yes, you're correct. There was a preliminary hearing where Charles Smith actually provided evidence to the court, which which a lot of people don't understand, is that Charles Smith he had barely any forensic training whatsoever. And by his own admissions at the Gouge inquiry, his training was either self-taught or woefully inadequate. He was not a certified forensic pediatric pathologist.
But he was highly respected at the time, right? Like in the legal community.
That's correct. During my case, two other experts were consulted or retained for opinion, and they both came back and concurred with Charles Smith, which was shocking to me. But it put me in a very precarious situation where I couldn't find anybody that was willing to challenge this man. And it would take about 16 years later before he's caught. That's what I call it, caught on another case.
Yeah.
And so at least, a decade and a half later, he was stopped.
And it turns out that he was involved in other cases as well, not just yours and that other one, but there were several other cases as well where, which is very...
There's more coming through.
Yeah. And all right. So this happened and you forgave him. And one of the things, though, is that I'm curious to know is that where did you find the strength? I mean, I understand forgiveness. We hear the concept of forgiveness, that it liberates you from the past and from whatever bad thing happened. but it is not easy, especially in your case. We're talking about several years. It's not like you lost a little bit of money. It's years that you'll never get back. It's time, spent away from your family, from your children when they were at a very young age. Where did you get the strength to get and find that ability to forgive Charles Smith?
I think, well, I mean, the
Is it
post-traumatic
faith? Is it your faith? Or, I mean,
my
what
mother,
is it?
my
Your
mother
mother.
was very instrumental in that search for forgiving him. My mother was my heroine, and not an evil bone in her body. And I can't help but think, and I think what drew me to that forgiveness was I truly believe that he has mental health issues.
Charles Smith.
Charles Smith,
Yeah.
to go through the system the way that he did and destroy that many lives without having any kind of, what's that word I'm looking for? Any moral compass or ethics in order to come forward and say, I can't do this job. Or I did this wrong, or this person's probably sitting in prison have been wrong, to not come forward. To me, there's got to be something going on there. And that was really the driving point for my forgiveness for the most part. But also many, many years I would spend, sitting in my garage going through banker's boxes and reading the paperwork and trying to understand, how could this happen despite everything that I was trying to forewarn everybody about? Why was I so insignificant? I thought by forgiving Charles Smith, it lifted a very huge part of the weight that I had carried for so long, that removed me from my children. And that was, I needed to go back now and actually be free as a mom, not be, held down with all these, false allegations and false convictions that I had lived with for so long. So, but that doesn't, a lot of people think that when I say forgiving Charles Smith is letting him go completely of
Or
other.
forget. Yeah, you don't forget what happened. Yeah.
No.
Well, and what also was remarkable is that your husband, your current husband, he is the father of Cassandra, right?
Yes.
And yet he stood by you the whole time, right?
Yes. So we're 33 years, married now, and we've been through hell and back so many times through this whole process at different levels and different stages. But at the end of the day, I think, where we both sit right now is that we don't want others to ever suffer this way again.
Yeah.
And the only way that we're going to be able to achieve that is to continue, being strong together and advocating for change.
And Maria, because I mean, you experienced firsthand how an expert was treated back then in a court of law. You're still involved in the criminal justice system, so you certainly still see how things are going. So, is there a shift in the perception? Like, do you feel like there has been a change towards experts and the way they're being perceived in the criminal justice system? Or is it the same? Is it better? What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that the court is more aware of what we should be doing in terms of qualifying experts before their evidence is accepted, which, I can tell you just from my preliminary hearing, reviewing the transcripts of it, it was very clear. Crown Counsel came in, brought the CV and tendered it as evidence at the prelim, and my defense counsel at the time just said, no problem. It was literally no problem. There was no question about the skills or training or expertise. There's nothing. It was just simply entered in. But what we're finding now is that the courts are paying more attention to see whether or not both the expertise that, not expertise, but both the training and the evidence that's being provided by an expert is actually matching up with the science. And that's really, really important.
Okay. And in your case, do you know if this was back then something that was the fact that your lawyer didn't seem to question the training of Dr. Smith? Is it just because it was Dr. Smith, or was this a general practice with any expert that was presented?
I can't speak to how they dealt with other experts, but what I can say that with Charles Smith, because he he was such a godlike figure at the time that it was, I feel like most defense counsel at the time felt like it was impossible to challenge this man.
Yeah.
And it was next to impossible to find other experts that would stand away from what Smith's opinions were. And even when we did do that, and we retained two other experts, they actually concurred with him. So what that told me is that he was very, very feared in the medical community. And nobody did.
Medical or legal or both?
Well, I believe medical, he was feared, but because he was placed on such a high pedestal by his two superiors, that really the expertise wasn't questioned. And that's where we went wrong. The oversight created a systemic problem where we were just accepting them for what they looked and said they were, as opposed to really making sure that they're qualified. The other thing that we didn't look at the time, and what we're looking at now, is an expert's error rates. It's important to know, what those statistics are, how much, what are your error rates, and how will it affect the outcome of the evidence that you'll provide in a trial. I know in the United States that in some courts, I believe one is in the 9th District Court, one of the judges there, if you have an error rate 5% and up, you're not testifying as an expert. I was shocked. I was expecting more in the lines of maybe a 50% error rate. No, when he said 5%, I was pretty impressed.
And so do you work in the States as well, or?
I do speaking engagements in the States, I also engage in panels there. So I was just in Detroit, just actually a couple of days before I was at the recent call conference. I was in Detroit, and I was there with the criminal conviction integrity unit of Wade County, and the director there. And I was also with Barbara McQuaid, MSNBC, who actually was moderating our panel, and two exonerees, recent exonerees, one that did 28 years, I believe, another one 17 years in the United States. What we honed in on is some of these very issues that you and I are discussing now. So to be able to look at how the United States is doing versus how we're doing, it's a very stark comparison of the numbers. But what we do realize is that very common errors are happening. The United States as well is getting to, how should I put it, learning now to accept more about shaken baby syndrome cases, that that science that has been behind it has been debunked. It doesn't the triads to a shaken baby syndrome cases is completely not reliable. So that's really important, because there's still cases in the United States that are actually being tried right now based on those very cases, which were similar to the Charles Smith cases. And then the stark difference between the United States and Canada is, in the United States, your judges are elected. Here in Canada, they're appointed. Thank God. I'm happy about that. Yeah.
And so in your case, the wrongful conviction was primarily due to an expert. It was because of an expert evidence and opinion that turned out to be wrong, that really was the main piece of evidence that the Crown relied on in their case. Now, because I know that you're still, you're involved in cases that deal with wrongful convictions in general, and sometimes wrongful convictions do occur even if there is no expert opinion that is involved. But I mean, do you see that, are you seeing any changes, any improvements in general, or just in the expert part of wrongful convictions?
No, I think what's happened is that right now what I'm seeing is that many defense counsel are taking further steps in order to ensure that evidence that's going to be, brought forward by the Crown will be challenged appropriately by getting your own defense expert to challenge those particular facts, if you want to call it. But at this point in time, defense counsel, I know that a lot of defense counsel now is taking a whole different approach, and that wrongful convictions is really top of the game now in order to bring the best defense for the best interest of your client. plea courts are still plea courts. What can I say? We're hoping that the plea courts and the numbers to the pleas will reduce and make sure that the pleas are actually legitimate pleas, as opposed to wrongful conviction pleas where, let's say a primary breadwinner at home doesn't have the time to sit in prison. He needs to get back home and, care for his family. He chooses to take a lesser offense for something he actually didn't do or she didn't do. So we're hoping that with the development of the Miscarriages of Justice Commission, that we'll be able to look at those wrongful convictions as well. So defense counsel is doing good. I'm seeing great progress there, and I'm so happy that many are on board. They're on board.
We just need to make sure we get to keep them on the defense side, that we don't lose them. So
yes,
that's
absolutely.
going to be important. I also wanted to ask you, Maria. So, in terms though of the perception of the public, because I'm guessing that when when your case was in court back then, the perception of the public was probably not in your favor. I'm guessing, because especially if Dr. Smith was a very powerful and very renowned expert at the time and very respected, I don't think that the public, I mean, is it fair to say they didn't really like you? The opinion wasn't in your favor. Have you seen any changes? What is the public perception now? Like, do you feel like there has been acceptance? Do people understand your story now? Has there been a shift in the public perception towards you?
I think with the development and the outpouring of awareness of wrongful convictions, the public is starting to embrace the fact that, yes, miscarriages of justice do happen. As an example, I used to be before I was, charged, I was actually a fan of that show Cops. I thought that every charge and every arrest was a legitimate arrest until I found myself in that very seat. In terms of, where we're headed now and how criminal defense is handling it, I think every criminal defense lawyer should know that there are tools out there to handle your case. Check for always, well, first and foremost, my advice always to future counsel will be, get disclosure, all of it, and ensure that your request says all disclosure, meaning audio, video, and make sure to indicate all those details in your request. Because if you don't, you might have your disclosure staggered, and that's just not, it's not gonna work out too well. The other thing too is, I find a lot of questions come in, and I get questions from young lawyers that are going to be young students that are going to become lawyers shortly. Well, what if I'm too scared to take on a case? Absolutely great that you're in touch with your feelings. However, there's nothing wrong with teaming up with another lawyer to do a case together. It's knowing how to reach out to the other sources or resources that you have in order to build your case. So I always tell them, don't just give up. Don't just turn it down. Take up the opportunity, build trust with your client. If you don't have trust, your client's not going to tell you the truth. They won't. They're going to just look at you as a lawyer and say, I'm paying you this much money and this is what you're supposed to do. Well, we have rights to uphold here, which is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. When we look at the Canadian Charter right now, 2022, this is the 40th year of the anniversary of the signing of the Canadian Charter of Rights. Imagine that Charles Smith wreaked havoc on 20 of those because there was lack of oversight. So it created a domino effect of systemic problems. What I often say is anybody working in the criminal justice system has a very significant, important, and fundamental gatekeeping role. So it doesn't just end at the police. It doesn't just end at prosecution. All of us, right up until a justice that's presiding on a bench, we have a duty to make sure that things are exactly what they should be. And it's not going to be perfect, but at least we're looking now. Whereas before it was just a simple, I mean, I used to going to courtrooms for counsel back in the 90s and do pre-trials and, you know, speak to matters. And I would hear these pleas that are going in and I would just shake my head thinking, my God, just like that, you know. And a lot of the times people entering these false guilty pleas don't understand the domino effects of a wrongful conviction. Like, sure, it's easy, you're going to get out, you're no longer being held in custody, but think about the long-term effects. Sorry, is that my puppy? Think about the long-term effect of how it'll affect you work-wise, how it'll affect you family-wise, you know, traveling as well. A lot of the times people aren't even aware of those issues and effects. Hi, my bud. Sorry. He just turned a year old, so always trying to get my attention here.
No. Yeah, well, and especially if the nature of the charge is a serious one, like it's
Absolutely.
that's definitely a situation where counsel should pause even more and discuss more with their client, especially, I mean, if the client wants to plead guilty, right? Because sometimes it's the client's choice. I mean, ultimately it is the client's choice, but it has to be informed and it has to be a very clear decision on the part of the client.
I believe there's a form that's now, I guess, being circulated, or it will be circulated soon for a far more depth plea inquiry. And it's a form that both the accused and defense, and I believe prosecution, have to complete together before a plea is entered. So I think that's going to be very, very helpful. The one concern I remember seeing something on a form for SCJ criminal. I think it was a pretrial memorandum or a brief. And I noticed that in one of those forums, it indicated offender. And I thought, right, if this person is still an accused, you know, the presumption of innocence is there, why are we referencing them as an offender? So I've already raised that. So hopefully that they'll make the correction as necessary. But these forms that I'm told are being used or starting to be used will be very helpful in making sure that all the check boxes are done before that plea is accepted.
Well, Maria, thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview for WiCCD. We're very happy that you're our guest today, and it's always very fascinating to hear from you. Honestly, it's just a pleasure to see you, to hear you speak, and to hear about your story. You're very inspiring. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure.